For 30 years, I made my living reading danger correctly. That was the actual job description, whether the paperwork said it or not. Detective, Phoenix Police Department, 1994 to 2024, and if you'd asked me at any point in that career whether Mexico was safe, I wouldn't have hesitated. I would have laughed. Honestly, the specific short laugh cops give civilians who ask questions they think are naive. I spent 3 decades reading crime reports, watching patterns, trusting data over feelings, and somewhere in all of that, without ever actually setting foot south of the border for more than a resort weekend, I'd built an absolutely rock-solid conviction that Mexico was a dangerous place. Cartels, kidnappings, the whole picture. I was completely wrong, and the way I found that out is the whole reason I'm making this video. If you're new to this channel, subscribe, because I break down decisions like this one every week, with actual numbers, not vibes. My name is David Anderson. I'm 65 years old, and for 3 decades I worked homicide and organized crime units in Phoenix, the kind of career that leaves you permanently oriented toward threat assessment, whether you want it to or not. My late wife Carol and I raised 2 kids in a quiet suburb north of the city, and by the time I retired in 2024, my pension and savings put me in a comfortable, but not extravagant position. The kind where you can live well in Arizona if you're careful, but where every unexpected expense, a roof, a hospital stay, matters more than it used to. Carol passed in 2022, pancreatic cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the funeral, and I won't dwell on that here, except to say that it changed how I thought about the years I had left in a way that 30 years of homicide work somehow hadn't managed to. I want to tell you about one specific case from my career, because it explains more about how I ended up believing what I believed than any general statement could. In 2011, I worked a homicide involving a family that had crossed illegally near Nogales, robbed and assaulted by smugglers who'd promised safe passage, and delivered the opposite. It was a brutal case, the kind that stays with you, and for years afterward, whenever anyone mentioned Mexico in casual conversation, that case was the image that surfaced first in my mind, unbidden, every single time. I never stopped to consider that I was generalizing an entire country of 126 million people from a single border region smuggling case. The way I never would have generalized all of Phoenix from any one homicide file sitting on my desk. That's the specific failure of reasoning that 30 years of professional pattern recognition should have protected me from, and instead, in this one area of my life, it did the opposite. My daughter Michelle moved to Querétaro, Mexico 3 years ago for her husband's job, an engineering position with an aerospace company that had set up operations there, and when she first told me, I remember my exact reaction, which I'm not proud of. I asked her, directly, whether they'd done a proper security assessment of the area before signing a lease. She laughed at me, the way your kids do when they think you've gone slightly ridiculous, and told me she felt safer walking her own neighborhood in Querétaro at 9:00 at night than she ever had in downtown Phoenix. I told her that was exactly the kind of thing people say right before something goes wrong, because that's the sentence 30 years of homicide work trains into you permanently. For 2 years I visited Michelle exactly twice, both trips under 5 days, both spent, I'll admit now, in a state of low-grade hypervigilance I never fully mentioned to her. I catalogued exits in restaurants. I noted which streets felt quieter than others, the way I would have on a case. I came home both times relieved nothing had happened, which in my head confirmed I'd simply gotten lucky, rather than confirming anything about the actual place. Then, in the spring after Carol's 2nd anniversary, Michelle sat me down over a video call and made an offer. Come live near us. Not visit. Live. My grandson Ethan was 4 years old at that point, and Michelle put it to me plainly. Dad, you can keep protecting yourself from a country you've never actually investigated, or you can come find out for yourself. The way you would have investigated anything else in your career. That last phrase landed harder than she probably intended it to. I want to be honest about what happened next, because I think it's the most useful part of this story for anyone watching who thinks the way I used to think. I didn't decide to move because I suddenly felt warm and fuzzy about Mexico. I decided to actually investigate the question the way I'd investigated everything else for 30 years, which meant ignoring my gut entirely and going straight to the data. I pulled homicide statistics by Mexican state, not national averages, which I already knew from casework tend to obscure more than they reveal. I compared Querétaro specifically, and later, Mérida, which kept surfacing in my research as a genuine outlier, against Phoenix's own numbers, the city I'd spent 3 decades patrolling and somehow never once described to my own family as dangerous, despite an annual homicide rate that, when I actually sat down and calculated it properly, ran higher than most of the Mexican cities where American retirees actually settle. That comparison stopped me cold for about a week. Phoenix, a city I'd defended reflexively for 30 years, a place I'd never once warned Michelle away from, carried a homicide rate that, city for city, exceeded several of the specific Mexican towns and cities popular with American retirees. I pulled up the numbers 3 separate times over that week, half expecting to find an error in my own math, the kind of thing you double-check on a case before you're willing to put your name on the report. I compared Phoenix against Mérida, then against San Miguel de Allende, then against the specific Querétaro neighborhood where Michelle actually lived, and the pattern held steady every single time. I'd spent 3 decades citing Phoenix's numbers to justify my own city's rough edges, treating them as the acceptable cost of an otherwise fine place to raise a family, while treating any Mexican statistic, regardless of context, as confirmation of a country-wide verdict I'd never actually researched. Mérida, in particular, kept appearing in every serious dataset I could find as one of the safest cities in the Americas, full stop, not just safest in Mexico. With survey data showing over 70% of residents reporting they felt safe walking alone in their own neighborhoods, a number most American cities of comparable size would kill for, if you'll forgive the phrase from a former homicide detective. I found a quarterly survey specifically measuring the daily lived safety experience of expats across Mexico, and the composite score sat at nearly 89 out of 100, with the overwhelming majority of any reported incidents being petty theft, a stolen phone, a snatched bag, the same category of crime that exists in every city on Earth, not the cartel violence I'd been picturing for 30 years without ever checking a single actual figure. The piece of the puzzle that genuinely reframed everything for me was understanding who Mexican violence actually targets. In my career, I'd investigated homicides that touched ordinary people constantly, random robberies that escalated, domestic situations, gang crossfire that caught bystanders. What the actual data showed me about Mexico was a different pattern entirely. The violence that drives the national statistics is overwhelmingly targeted, cartel members against other cartel members, and specific individuals connected to that world, not random civilians and certainly not foreign retirees walking to a market. That's not a comforting fact for the people caught in that specific violence, and I want to be clear, I'm not minimizing it. But as a risk assessment for a 65-year-old American retiree choosing where to live, it's a completely different calculation than the one I'd been running in my head for 30 years based on headlines alone. I chose Mérida specifically, in the end, not Querétaro where Michelle lived, though it's only about a 5-hour drive between them, close enough for regular visits. Mérida's specific advantages, once I actually researched them properly, were substantial. Geographic distance from the northern border smuggling routes that generate most of the violence I'd been picturing, a walkable colonial center with genuine 16th century architecture, a large, established foreign resident community that made the transition easier for a 65-year-old widower starting over alone, and crime statistics that, when I ran them the way I'd run any case file, simply didn't support the fear I'd been carrying around for 30 years. I flew down for a scouting trip in the fall, stayed 12 days, and I'll admit my first week was almost comically consistent with everything I just told you about myself. I checked door locks twice before bed out of pure muscle memory. I mentally logged which streets had better lighting. I found myself, on day 4, actually laughing out loud at my own behavior while sitting in a small cafe in the Santa Ana neighborhood, watching families walk past with strollers at 9 at night, teenagers on bicycles, an elderly man walking his dog, with the completely unhurried body language of someone who'd never once considered that walk unsafe in his entire life. 30 years of detective work had trained me to read body language for threat, and every single signal I was reading in that plaza said the opposite of what my gut kept insisting I should feel. The moment that actually broke through, and I think about this constantly, happened on day 7. I'd left my wallet, genuinely left it, sitting on a table at an outdoor restaurant near the main plaza. Distracted by a phone call from Michelle about Ethan's school enrollment, I didn't notice for almost 40 minutes, well into a walk back toward my rental. When I finally patted my pocket and realized it was gone, every instinct from 30 years of casework kicked in simultaneously, and I fully expected to spend the rest of that evening canceling cards and filing a police report I assumed would go nowhere. I walked back toward the restaurant, already composing the story I'd tell Michelle about how right I'd been. The waiter who'd served me was standing at the entrance holding my wallet, cash and cards untouched, having apparently asked several nearby vendors if anyone recognized the American who'd been sitting at table 6. He handed it back with a small shrug, as if the entire episode barely registered as noteworthy, and when I tried to press a substantial tip into his hand as thanks, he initially waved it off, genuinely reluctant, before finally accepting it with what looked like mild embarrassment rather than gratitude. I stood on that sidewalk afterward running the scenario back through my head, the way I'd have reviewed evidence on any case, and I couldn't find a single American city, including my own, where I'd have confidently predicted that outcome for a stranger's wallet left in plain view for 40 minutes. I want to comment down below and ask you honestly, when's the last time something like that happened to you back home? Because for me, the honest answer was never. Not once in 65 years. I moved permanently 5 months later, into a small colonial-style house, with a central courtyard in a neighborhood called Itsim, close enough to walk to Michelle's favorite bakery when she visits from Curtaro, which she now does almost monthly with Ethan in tow. My rent runs $650 a month for a genuinely beautiful space, high ceilings, tile floors original to the building, the kind of architecture that would cost 4 or 5 times that in an equivalent American city. But the number that actually matters to this story isn't the rent, it's the fact that I now walk to the Mercado most evenings after dark, alone, at 65, something I would have actively discouraged Carol from doing in our own Phoenix neighborhood, without a second thought. Learning Spanish at 65, after a career spent giving orders in English and expecting compliance, was its own exercise in humility. I hired a tutor twice a week, a retired university professor named Professor Alvarado, and our first several sessions consisted mostly of him patiently correcting my flat, cop voice pronunciation, while I fumbled through basic conversations like a rookie failing his field training. I've gotten functional, not fluent, enough to handle the market, the pharmacy, a real conversation with a neighbor about the weather, or Ethan's latest school project. What surprised me most was how often those halting conversations turned into something warmer than I expected. Neighbors genuinely delighted by the effort rather than impatient with the mistakes. A patience I don't remember extending nearly as often to the Spanish-speaking families I encountered over 30 years of casework back in Phoenix. A fact that sits with me more than I initially expected it to. I've become, somewhat to my own surprise, an informal resource for new American retirees arriving in Merida, with the exact fears I used to carry. A local expat group asked me, about 8 months after I settled in, if I'd help put together an actual orientation session for newcomers, given my law enforcement background. And I now do this maybe once a month, sitting with a room full of anxious new arrivals, walking them through the same data I walked myself through, city-by-city homicide comparisons against wherever they're from, an explanation of targeted versus random violence, practical situational awareness that has nothing to do with the cartoon version of danger most of them arrived with. Somebody usually asks, almost every session, whether I'm just telling them what they want to hear, and I understand the skepticism, because I would have asked the exact same question myself 2 years earlier. My answer is always the same. I spent 30 years building a career on not telling people what they wanted to hear, and I'm not about to start now, in a room full of strangers, over a topic that could genuinely affect where they choose to spend what's left of their lives. I watch the same transformation happen in almost every session. The visible relief on someone's face when they realize their fear was built on headlines rather than statistics. The exact process I went through myself sitting alone at my kitchen table with Michelle's words in my head. About a year into living in Merida, I met a local police commander named Comandante Ricardo P. at a community safety forum I'd been invited to observe, and what started as a polite professional introduction turned into a standing monthly coffee between us. 2 men who'd spent their careers on opposite sides of the same border, thinking about the same fundamental problem. He asked me, early on, what had genuinely surprised me most about policing philosophy here compared to Phoenix, and I told him honestly, the emphasis on community relationship over enforcement statistics, officers who knew shopkeepers and vendors by name, in a way that would have seemed almost impossibly old-fashioned in my old precinct. He laughed and told me that was precisely the model Merida's police force had deliberately built over the past 2 decades, treating visible community trust as a genuine safety metric worth investing in, not just a public relations talking point. I'd spent 30 years measuring safety almost exclusively in closure rates and response times. Sitting across from him, I found myself reconsidering whether I'd been measuring the right things all along. I still think like a detective, and I don't believe that instinct ever fully retires, regardless of the address on your driver's license. I still notice exits. I still read a room, but 30 years of that training, applied honestly to actual data, instead of assumption, is precisely what brought me here, rather than keeping me away. The irony isn't lost on me, and it shouldn't be lost on you either, if you're watching this with the same reflexive fear I used to carry. The career that should have made me most qualified to assess this risk accurately is the same career that for 30 years, let me get it completely backward, simply because I never once did the actual investigation until my own daughter forced the question. Last week, Ethan, now 7, spent the weekend with me while Michelle and her husband took a short trip. We walked to the plaza at dusk, the way half the neighborhood does, past vendors selling elote and marquesitas, past teenagers playing basketball under the streetlights with no adult supervision anywhere in sight, the kind of unsupervised freedom that would trigger every alarm bell in an American parent's head. Ethan held my hand for exactly the first block, then let go and ran ahead toward the fountain, the complete, unguarded confidence of a child who has never once been taught that the world outside his door is something to fear. I stood there for a moment watching him, a retired homicide detective, who'd spent 3 decades believing he understood danger better than almost anyone. Finally understanding that the most dangerous thing I'd been carrying for 30 years wasn't anything in Mexico. It was a conclusion I'd never actually checked. I think about Carol sometimes on those evening walks, and about the version of retirement we'd planned together before her diagnosis, which never once included leaving Arizona. I don't know what she would have made of Merida, and I'll admit that not knowing is one of the harder parts of building this new life alone, but I know she would have recognized the process that got me here, because it was the same process I used on every case we ever discussed at our own kitchen table, over 30 years of marriage. Follow the evidence, not the assumption. Check your own bias before you close the file. I spent my entire career telling witnesses, suspects, junior detectives, anyone who'd listen, that the story you assume is true is usually the first thing that gets you the wrong conclusion. It took losing my wife, and nearly losing my relationship with my only grandson's daily presence in my life to finally apply that same standard to myself. I'm grateful, more than I can easily put into words, that Michelle pushed hard enough to make me actually run the numbers, instead of trusting 30 years of unexamined instinct. I'm David Anderson. Thank you for listening to Retired in Mexico.